The passages that I'll be reading from in this video is from the book The Missionaries, God Against the Indians by Norman Lewis. And this book is what inspired me to make this video because it made me think about the use of religion in general that was used to subjugate the indigenous people. And when I say indigenous, I mean the so-called black people or the so-called African Americans of today in the United States and in places like South America and the West Indies. A lot of our people are there as well, and they're misclassified as African. And as a side note, you may hear some West Indians or even some people from South America who will say that they're not African, and they're actually right in that regard. And we're not African in North America either, because many of them still speak to their elders who know the truth and the reality and tell their children that they never came from Africa, they were always here. But anyway, religion was used to conquer our people in the Americas because we were just too strong to have a head-on fight with. Yes, you had what was called the American Indian Wars, but there was not constant warfare going on everywhere all the time at the same time. The Europeans did not have the resources to do that, okay? So what they had to do was they had to use religion to mentally subjugate the American indigenous people and allow the foreigners to come in and do what they please, whether it be kill a bunch of our people with no repercussions, kind of like you see today in the news and the media. You know, a so-called black person will get shot down or killed unlawfully, and instead of punishing the person properly, the family members of the person, you know, that was killed will say, oh, well, I forgive you. We've seen that a lot in the news media. To be honest, those people have probably been paid off a lot of money. I don't really have a high opinion of people who will say, oh, I forgive the murderer of my son or my daughter or whatever for X amount of dollars, but hey, that's what's going on. But the fact of the matter is, from the very beginning, Christianity specifically was used and brought over here to the Americas to mentally subjugate and conquer the people before there was a physical conquering and subjugation. Because you got to think about and ask the question, what is Christianity for? What's the purpose? The purpose is to subjugate and weaken the minds of the people who believe in Christianity in order to allow their conquerors, the people who are actually bringing their religion in, to do as they please. And isn't that what they're doing today? They can do, you know, people are doing whatever they want to do in the name of God or Christianity, or saying, God will forgive me no matter what I do. That's what the people back in the ancient world, they thought the same way. These conquistadors and these priests who are coming over from Europe, especially Spain, they thought the same way. Well, I've been baptized in the name of Jesus, so I can do whatever I want to do because I go to heaven. So not only does it allow the conquerors to do as they please, it also allows the indigenous people to be in subservience to them, who they view indirectly or directly as God. Because those conquerors, these foreigners who brought in Christianity, they put themselves up as the image of God. Like the painting of Jesus by Leonardo da Vinci. This is clearly a Caucasian male. So when they were bringing Christianity over here, what do you think the image of Jesus, God, the Holy Trinity, whatever, would be the image as? Because if Jesus is considered God's son and Jesus is Caucasian, then so would God be. That's like the logical line of thinking or linear line of thinking that you would, you know, go with. Logic doesn't go with religion at all, but if we're going to speak in that aspect of religion, if Jesus is God's son, then therefore God is also Caucasian. So you're automatically going to view Caucasians as something, or this being, this deity, this as a whole. You're going to see Caucasians as a group not to be messed with, not to be harmed, not to disobey in any way. But to your own people, oh yeah, you'll shoot them down all day long, you'll sell drugs to them, you'll make songs about harming and killing and destroying your own people. Where are the rap songs talking about destroying everybody else? How come it's always got to be your own people, but everybody else is who wants you destroyed? But your own people just trying to live their life day to day, most of the time. But the main reason why this was so effective was because of the naivety and the illogical thinking from the indigenous people. They didn't ask any questions. Just like how today, a lot of the so-called black people, the indigenous people that have been indoctrinated in the Americas today with Christianity, they don't ask any logical questions. If you do try to point out to them how dumb this Jesus story, or how dumb Christianity is in general, and why it's pushed on them, they won't accept it. So just like back in the day, they were extremely naive in thinking that these foreigners that were coming over here were not going to harm them in any way. They had no proof of that. They had no real intentions of really getting to know why these people were here. As long as they didn't show up shooting and killing everybody in sight, these Caucasians, foreigners, the Asians, whoever could just set up shop and just live with us, mix in with us, and slowly over time take over our culture, or push us out, or betray us to the other Europeans that were coming over here. And the Panara Indians, who the Bible was specifically made, or there was a Bible specifically made for them, known as the Panara Bible. I don't know if I'm pronouncing Panara, correctly. That's how I'm gonna say it in this video. They should not have just accepted whatever these foreigners and strangers said. And the same thing with us, the unmixed indigenous people. When they began being attacked, raped, tortured, all that stuff, we should have fought back. There shouldn't have been no friendships or alliances made with these foreigners coming over here. But they allowed the quote-unquote peaceful Caucasians to come in and live amongst us, learn our language, learn our culture, and what are they bringing? The missionaries. Let me learn the language so I can teach them some BS. So that I can bring in my more violent brothers to come and take over this land and kill anybody who gets in our way. So we allow these quote-unquote peaceful Caucasians to come in, not knowing or understanding that they were making way for their violent kin to come in, just like today. And you go to work, or you go to this grocery store, and you go about your day, and there are a lot of Caucasians that don't really mess with you, they don't really speak to you. Okay, that's fine. You may have some Caucasians friends, but they're not helping you. And that's not their job, that's not their responsibility to help the indigenous Americans. They still think that you're black. Come at them with the evidence that you never came from Africa and that you're not black, obviously. They can't even look at you and question, hey, why is my friend called black when his skin's not black? They don't even think about that. So how are they going to be able to help you? Yeah, they're not bashing your brains out. Yeah, okay, they might be decent, but they're not. That doesn't help. Being a decent person does not help you or your people when you're in such bad shape as we are today. Okay, we don't have time for, oh well, not all of them are like this, or not all of them are mean, some of them are nice. Like, okay, but that's not gonna help you get out of poverty, get out of the hood or the projects. It's not going to stop all these baby mamas. It's not going to stop all these gang banging thugs and all these drug dealers in our community. It's not going to stop this individuality that's plaguing black people, that's preventing them from coming together in a real community. That's not helping them. A friendly Caucasian is not helping us do any of the stuff that actually matters. And it didn't help us back then either. In fact, it made room for a lot of people to be slaughtered. The purpose of a quote-unquote peaceful foreigner is to soften up the indigenous people so they won't fight back as hard when they start, chopping people down and mowing people down. That's why the Pacific Islanders didn't fight back. That's why they continue to follow their drunken leader. And they're like, well, who else are we gonna? I guess we don't know what else to do. We'll just follow whatever he says, and we're not gonna rise up and revolt and say, hey, this is wrong. We're not gonna tolerate this anymore. We'll just keep on going, just like today. Go along to get along. But now look at them. Look at the Tahitians today, which was one of the islands that the European or the Spanish missionaries came to conquer. Look at them today versus 100, 200 years ago. They're a fraction of who they were before. They're not even the same people anymore. They've been so mixed down. All these so-called Spanish looking or Mexican looking or Caucasian looking people that you see in these photographs, or these Asian looking ones, they were not over there 100, 200, 300 years ago. They had been mixed down, and the indigenous people in Tahiti had been killed or mixed down, so much so to the point where there's the whole other races of people have replaced them today. And even Captain James Cook knew how bad it was going to be for the original or the indigenous Tahitians once they arrived at their islands, because he knew what his people's intentions were. It was to come and subjugate and destroy these people. to take over their islands, take over the lands, and to eventually replace them or have complete and utter control of them if they couldn't all be killed off. So let's take a look at this passage here. When Cook left Tahiti at the end of his second mission, he wrote in his journal, "I directed my course to the west and we took our final leave of these happy islands and the good people on them." Some years later he was to write, "It would have been far better for these poor people to never have known us." So he fully admits that these are good people. Like they welcomed us with open arms, they fed us, they clothed us, they gave us fresh water, when we stopped our ship at these islands. And what did they do? Well, let's look at with the Tahitians today. We know exactly what happened. Now let's continue on to this passage. In Tahiti, he has become a kind of folk hero. And the memory of him was that he spent much of his spare time playing with the local children out. This passage is talking about Captain Bligh, I think it's pronounced, of the Bounty, okay, which is another sailor who came to Tahiti. So apparently he's a folk hero to the people of Tahiti. I don't know how. When later on in this book, and it's a long book. I'm not going through the entire book, but if you go and read this book, the Tahitians did not have it good. Okay? Eventually the Europeans tried to enslave them, to make them grow and pick food for them under harsh conditions, of course. Cut down a lot of their breadfruit trees just to force them and get them to work for food and grow food for the Europeans. But he's a folk hero because it's one person who didn't harm us. Well, he's considered a folk hero. Like, okay, but like I said before, he made way for all his kin to come and inflict violence upon the Tahitians. But somehow Captain Bligh, is a folk hero. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of parallels and ironies compared to back then and today with black people, so-called. And then it says here, when he finally sailed, he wrote, "I left these happy islanders with much distress, for the utmost affection, regard, and good fellowship was among us during our stay. Their good sense and observations, joined with the most engaging disposition in the world, will ever make them beloved by all who become acquainted with them as friends." A few days later, the famous mutiny on the Bounty took place due to the determination of members of his crew not to return to England, but to remain and settle on the islands where they had found so much happiness. So, these guys didn't want to go back to Europe. They wanted to stay in Tahiti. What do you think they did in Tahiti? They had sex with the women and then they'll produce mixed children. And so on and so forth. So I don't understand why this is so far-fetched to say, hey, the Tahitians are today, and the indigenous people or the Native Americans that they want to put up in these fake photographs and in media of today are not the actual first indigenous people. They're mixed down. I don't understand why people find that so hard to believe when there have been foreigners traveling and mixing with each other since forever. Like, it's not this huge, humongous deal. People make it a big deal because of the lie saying that Asians who come from Asia are suddenly indigenous to America. I don't understand that. No, you're indigenous to Asia and you sailed over here. Mixed with the actual indigenous Americans, which is how you got darker skin, because there's no way you're gonna come over to America and then you got dark skin just for living here. It gets cold here, especially places in North America. It snows in a lot of places. If it doesn't snow, it gets really cold. So how did you get darker skin? But when you were in Asia, you had lighter skin? Because when they show the indigenous Asians, those are pale skin. That's what they tell us. So how did your skin color change? And this is going to be another video about the flaws in the evolution theory by Charles Darwin, which makes no sense at all. They can't answer how long does it take for your entire phenotype and genotype to change from being in another environment. And why haven't so-called black people who've been living in cold places for generations, how come their skin hasn't gotten pale and how come their hair hasn't started getting straight? Well, that's for another time. Anyway, let's continue on to the next passage. In 1795, the London Missionary Society was formed, its immediate attention focused upon the Pacific. 2 years later, a convict ship bound for Australia put the first missionaries ashore on Tahiti. They too were overwhelmed by the warmth of their welcome, and since the Tahitians were clearly disposed to give things away, they asked for the Bay of Matavai, where they had landed, to be given to them. The request was instantly granted by the local chief, who had no conception of private property and land, and was later disconcerted to learn that he and his people were to be debarred from the area. Huh. You don't think so? So these foreigners, these people who you may have met, others of their kind before, and just because they didn't all outright slaughter you, you say, oh yeah, you can go over there, and then they're like, hey, they're keeping us from coming into this area, man. I don't know what we'll do. I guess we'll just stay on this side of the island. Are you crazy? You should have ran those people out. You didn't think to yourself, say, I don't know what the intentions of these foreigners are, these newcomers are. Maybe it's not a good idea for us to just allow people who we don't know, who don't even look like us at all, to come over here. In fact, you know what? I'm not even gonna think about why they're here. I'm just gonna go and live my life. And then if we read here, children called upon to line up and repeat over and over again this simple verse in Tahitian, did so obligingly and with good grace. So it basically translates to, for what is Jehovah angry with thee? Because I am evil and do evil. This is what they were teaching the Tahitian children, and this is what the Tahitians were allowing their children to be taught. You know what that sounds like? Black people who send their children to public school and private school to be taught lies. Black people who send their children to churches, Sunday school. Black people who just allow foreigners to tell them anything at all, as if they're gonna tell you the truth. So the white man lies, but he tells you the truth when it comes to you coming from Africa, huh? I see. We've been doing this for too long, man. I'm flabbergasted about how they allow their children to be around these foreigners, around people who you don't know. That's terrifying to me. Especially, what we know that will happen later on. And if they couldn't convert all of us, let's say the rest of the indigenous people who were still in more rural areas of the islands, or we'll focus on the continent of South America, they'd massacre them, as we read here. Some of these would have been cleared of the original Indian population, as it was later learned, by such methods as aerial bombardment. So it's not just so-called Black Wall Street and all these other places, that the original indigenous Americans were living in that were bombed. Here in America, it's happening in South America, it's happening everywhere. As soon as these Caucasians made planes, they thought to themselves, you know what, instead of trying to, do some glorious things by having the wonderful ability to fly, let's drop bombs and kill all these indigenous people. That's the first thing we should do, guys. That's how their thinking is. But you want to get with, okay, let's keep reading. Aerial bombardment, poisoning by mixing arsenic with gifts of sweets. They say, hey, I brought some candy, knowing that it's going to poison and kill them. That happened. Oh, we don't talk about that happening in North America. They just want to talk about disease and guns and stuff like that. But no, it was a lot more stuff, a lot more horrible things going on about how our people were killed. The production of local epidemics by the distribution of clothing infected by the microbes of deadly disease, of course, or more commonly by armed expeditions of mercenary gunmen, basically people with guns who are paid to go in and shoot everybody on sight, men, women, and children, okay? All these things were eventually made public in a white paper published by the Brazilian government. Action, however, came late, and it will never be known how many thousands or tens of thousands of Indians perished at this time. But we're not done yet. Here's another passage in chapter 6. In the 50s, yes, the 1950s, not the 1850s, the 1950s, guys, the great extermination of the forest Indians of South America began. It was a secret operation conducted behind the world's back in the hitherto largely impenetrable forests of Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil, and unsuspected by the ordinary citizens of those countries. Keep in mind that Brazil has the largest American indigenous or so-called Black population in the Americas, okay? So these weren't just mixed, Native Americans that are being killed and shot down. Because if this was an undercover operation, You're not gonna have photographs. So, well, how do you know that? They're not gonna have photographs because they went undercover to murder all these people. And you gotta ask the question, why would they do that? Why would you just go out and murder all these people for what? Why can't you just bring them into society? And if it's just for land, like, no, it wasn't just for the land, because those jungles are still impenetrable. They did not cut down those jungles and use them for some type of agriculture. They just went in, killed all the indigenous people and left. Because they don't want you there. They do not want you cut off from their society where they cannot control you. If they can't control you, they want you dead. Okay? That's real. That's what's going on in the world. It's no happy, well, we can get politics. At the end of the day, at the heart of it, these people do not want you here if they cannot control you, okay? That's how demonic and desperate these people are, if you even want to call them people. Due to the involvement of dictatorial governments in control of a muzzled press, no estimate will ever be possible of the death roll among the Indians of Paraguay and Bolivia. In Brazil, as soon as news of the nature and scale of the tragedy leaked out, immediate and effective action was taken against those responsible, and there was no attempt at a cover-up. It was a different matter to bring the instigators of such crimes to book, for only too often they proved to be powerful, even international land speculators. It was a time too when multinational corporations were joining the drive to develop the untapped natural resources and to fill the apparently empty spaces of Latin America. No, there were no empty spaces. Anytime they tell you there's a country that was empty and there was nobody there, they're lying. There were people there. That's why they had to kill them. Because if it was empty, why are you killing all these people who were living there? Those who organized the massacres were in most cases functionaries of the Indian Protection Service. So the very group that was made supposedly to protect the Indians are what instigated the murder and the massacre. I hope that makes you think about all these so-called organizations that are made for black people who are still referring to us as black and African American after we know the truth of where we come from. People still believe that they can somehow actually help us. All right, well, I bet the indigenous Americans who knew of the Indian Protection Service thought about that too. I bet the civilians in Bolivia and Paraguay and Bolivia thought that this group would protect the Indians too. Just keep in mind that these people will blatantly lie to your face, okay? They are not for you. They're not here to lift you up or help you or put you above them or give you equality or whatever in any way, shape, or form. And you know, I remember I saw this meme once saying that this is how so-called black people were made Christians by force, basically. And it's actually right. How could our ancestors have, and how could you continue to follow a religion, whether it's Hebrew Israelitism, Islam, Christianity, whatever? How could you follow a religion in which those same people that force it on you through deception and violence in order to gain material things and turn you from a soul being into a spirit being, they use it as a tool to control you, and you don't realize that? How could you continue to follow religion with all of these horrible, horrible, degenerate things done in the name of God? You really believe there's a God that's going to punish those people who did these heinous things in the name of God? But meanwhile, those same people are telling you that your heaven is after you die, and they're making a heaven on earth with your stuff and killing anybody who gets in their way. So they understand the psychological warfare. Even back then they understood it. That's why they wanted to push the religion so hard. They don't care what they have to do to make sure the indigenous people do not rise up. And in the Panare Indian Bible, they even took out large sections of the actual Bible, the King James Bible, and rewrote it just to accuse them of killing Jesus so that they can repent for their sins and feel guilty and want to be Christians, basically. But I thought it said in the Bible not to tamper with what has been supposedly written by God. But oh well, to these people the ends justify the means, and the end result was our people being broke and broken, fractured, identifying as evil and nothing at the same time. Some call it black, some want to call it African American. It's the same thing, okay? Even though your own family elders will tell you that they never came from Africa, and if they do come from Africa, they can name the place in Africa they came from. But your elders will tell you, I'm from this tribe, I'm from this American indigenous tribe. Excuse me, I'm Chowani, I'm Cherokee, I'm Blackfoot. And you believed and you allow your children to believe strangers in a school telling you that you came from someplace else. But to be honest, I can't think of a more accurate title for our situation than from this book, God Against the Indians. Because their God, which is them, the God is Caucasian. That's them. That's God. So when they say God, they mean a Caucasian. That's why they had a Caucasian as Jesus. Their God was never for you. It was never to help you. They can't even leave you alone because you'll surpass them without their interference. So for any of the times that they aren't there, they've made sure to fill up your head with all of these lies so that you can get a false history. So you have false questions that have false answers. Just in case you ask any logical questions, they say, well, we already have an answer for that. It's like, well, I just don't know where do you really come from? You come from Africa. Where in West Africa? I don't know. It doesn't matter though. You were a slave and you're a descendant of a slave, the ADOS. Okay, but where's the proof of what you need proof for? You kind of like the Africans, even though they don't identify as you, and they don't have a story of an African slave trade going on. Nobody in West Africa can tell you an actual story. They want to show you all these relics and remnants and all these places that this is where the ship was. Okay, where are the stories? There's millions of people were taken from West Africa. Don't you think somebody would have passed that down and say, hey, don't go to the beach? Like, oh yeah, my great-great-grandmother will always say, that her mother told her not to go to the beach. You don't hear that. Okay? But for all of the Christianity and all these religions that were pushed on us, that doesn't stop the identity crisis that so-called Black people keep having. If African American is our nationality, then why question who we are still? Why are you still trying to search for who you are? I don't know who I am. People have been existential crises. Because if you just stop believing what your enemies and those who hate you are telling you, you'll realize that logically nothing that they've told you makes any sense. Like a Caucasian God, for example, or you coming from Africa. Our ancestors didn't question any of that. But it's 2023 now. You gotta be better than them. Everybody wants to talk about what we used to do in the ancient world. We gotta be better than what we used to do in the ancient world. And it starts with this. It starts with asking questions. It starts with not taking anything at face value just because they have a degree or just because they're Caucasian or whatever. If it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense, no matter who it comes from. So I highly suggest that you get this book and read it through and through to really see and know and understand all the stuff that was going on, especially concerning religion with our people back in the day and how that's affecting us today. Because they want to talk about Willie Lynch and all this stuff. No, this is what was really going on, okay, both in North and South America. Mainly focuses on South America. This is happening all over the continent. So that's the end of this video. I'll see you next time on the Ethnic American channel.